Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Florence. Andiamo avanti. Renaissance people, welcome back to the Italian Renaissance podcast. And today we are going to discuss one of the most important and critical moments in the history of Renaissance art. That is the brief period where the young master, Raphael of Urbino, was in Florence at the exact same time as both Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. For Michelangelo, he returned to Florence around 1501, and Leonardo sometime in 1500. Raphael must have arrived around 1504. Now, this is the post-Savonarola period in Florence, one that saw the election of Gonfaloniere for life to the esteemed Piero Soderini in 1502. The position of Gonfaloniere, that is the head of the republic, typically was a temporary post. So this lifelong appointment was in order to try to establish a more stable republic after the turmoil caused in the wake of Savonarola, the Dominican friar who held a tyrannical and theocratic grip on Florence and its society after the expulsion of the Medici. So it is in these years that we refer to the system in Florence as the Soderini Republic, which had its foundations in the final years of the 1490s, and his reign as Gonfaloniere for life was from 1502 to 1512. In 1512, when the Medici returned with an army and exiled Soderini to Rome. But we see Raphael come to Florence from Perugia at the time of relative Florentine stability when Soderini was looking to expand and reestablish the visual tradition of Florentine republicanism. It is in this very spirit that Michelangelo begins and completes his masterpiece. You guys know the one, the colossal, the giant, the David, which was originally destined to be the first sculpture to redecorate the pinnacles of the cathedral, but in the spirit of the renewed republic, it was decided to be positioned right in front of the Palazzo dei Priori, that is the Palazzo Vecchio today, in 1504. With David being one of the most well-known works of art in the entire world, I do not want to labor the point of its magnificence. However, let me give you some interesting information on David so that we can understand how it elevated Michelangelo to stardom alongside Leonardo in this critical moment in Florence. The original block of marble was meant for a colossal sculpture to adorn one of the pinnacles of the Florence Duomo, but that was abandoned. So he was carved by Michelangelo. We call it ex uno lapide, from a single block of marble, this one being Carrara marble. And this block in particular was damaged after decades of sitting about the Duomo workshop and after those failed carving attempts by the previous artists during the Quattrocento. That means Michelangelo was working with damaged marble and the remains of previous carve attempts, which forced him to adopt the base form of another artist's composition. So David was adapted and molded from the composition decided by somebody else. The contract for the artwork between Michelangelo and those who oversaw it, the Wool Guild, and the members of the Wool Guild known as the Operai, which are responsible for the decoration of the cathedral, specifically stated that Michelangelo would work from the piece of marble that was both, and this is a quote from the contract, formerly blocked out and blocked out badly. So even the Operai are like, hey, this isn't looking so good. We need someone who is really going to be able to take this poorly blocked out, damaged work of marble and turn it into something magnificent. Michelangelo began carving it in 1501 after having, guys, listen to this, a wall constructed around it for secrecy. He didn't want anyone to see what he was doing, effectively building a small studio inside the Duomo workshop. It was finished in 1504. It is the first colossal marble sculpture since antiquity. Okay? It was so big They had to remove the arch of the door to get it out of the Palazzo courtyard behind the Duomo in Florence. It took them 4 days to move it, what is today a 5 to 10 minute walk in central Florence. And the nudity was not universally accepted. And David originally wore a gilded belt, and he was also gilded in other places like his hair, which would have had a decorative garland. He also would have had a bit of a gold shimmer to him from all of these different places of gilding. So there was a little bit more of this multicolored interaction with light, metal pieces on him. He was not just this freestanding piece of marble. We also know the finances of this. Michelangelo was paid 400 florins for this work, where the average skilled laborer earned about the average skilled laborer. This was not the average income. The average skilled laborer, which a sculptor was considered, would earn about 50 florins annually. So he got 400 total from September of 1501 to sometime in 1504, so above average. And we can also go back in time to make a guess that Soderini himself might have had a hand in Michelangelo getting the commission, as Michelangelo trained in Lorenzo the Magnificent's household. If you guys listened to the episode I did on the young Michelangelo, one of the people that he trained with there was Francesco Soderini, Piero Soderini's brother. So even with the Medici gone, that history of fondness and companionship and learning together, it was still very present. And the connection with Michelangelo to the Soderini family was there. It's also in this moment, 1503, that Leonardo da Vinci begins his greatest work, the Mona Lisa, probably a portrait of the noblewoman Lisa del Giocondo, although it evolved into more of a mystical, ideal essence of a sitter. This painting was never given to the patrons, as Leonardo would seemingly obsess over its perfection and take with him everywhere he went for the rest of his life until his death in France in 1519. Now, should we recall the court portraits that Leonardo did in Milan, namely the lady with an ermine, we know that Leonardo is drawing from his previously established portrait conventions with the Mona Lisa. This work will be absolutely fundamental in understanding Raphael's pictorial development, which we'll get to by the end of the episode. So, what are those conventions of portraiture developed by Leonardo? It's the intimacy of the sitter and the presentation of them in a sense of time and space rather than just the mere representation of them, like we saw by Piero della Francesca in his portraits of Duke Federico of Montefeltro and Battista Sforza. It is not just the presentation of them in symbols that adorn them, okay? It is a temporal and spatial representation. And it is in the access to their glance that Leonardo gives us, especially for the females, that opens them to the spiritual and intellectual reading through their eyes, which Leonardo called the window to their souls. It is also the use of setting in the way that Mona Lisa appears to turn and smile at you as you gaze upon her. Of course, there are a million theories about her, some of them outlandish, like this is Leonardo in drag, or this is Salai. Some of them entertaining, like this is of window into eroticism. Or some of these interpretations are very thought provoking, the idea of the ideal sitter presented in paint. But none of them are conclusive. All of that is to say, this moment in Renaissance art history, where we get David, where we get Mona Lisa, is undoubtedly one of the biggest and most critical, especially for the young Raphael, who would go on to forever change the language of Renaissance painting during the High Renaissance in Rome due to his exposure to Michelangelo and Leonardo at this moment where he goes to Florence to study and learn. Truly, the spirit of pushing the limits of art seemed to be at the forefront of Soderini's conception of his new public visual culture. We have to keep in mind that Michelangelo was now a superstar after David, and the older Leonardo had already built himself quite a large reputation. Renaissance people, try to imagine this if you will. Two cultural giants now inhabiting the same space, but who had two radically different and opposed presences. Okay, Michelangelo was devoutly Christian, and we know struggled with reconciling that devout faith with his romantic and erotic tastes towards other men. He was quite moody, he was testy, he was hard to work with, and he was overly dramatic about things. Nor was he particularly attractive with his broken nose that he earned getting punched in the face as an apprentice. Meanwhile, Leonardo was full of charisma and charm. He was famously handsome, although he's older now, and there's a lot of reasons to believe he was not particularly a Christian, or at least not enough of a Christian to be tormented by any of its rules, laws, or creeds. So everywhere he went, he also had the youthful Salai with him, no doubt an attraction to other Florentine youths and nobility alike during this period. Michelangelo and Leonardo were even at odds about method and medium, Michelangelo being a staunch proponent of the superiority of sculpture, and Leonardo advocating for painting. Even within painting, their styles were in direct contrast, with Michelangelo preferring the linear method with outlined, bold color systems, and Leonardo always using his trademark invention, sfumato, the blurred effect in oil painting that he does by smudging the lines.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people. Do you want more content and maybe to help support this show? Join me on Patreon for exclusive podcast episodes, or if you want a visual experience, you can enroll in my Udemy course, which teaches the Florentine Renaissance and includes nearly 12 hours of art history lectures. You can also find podcast merch on our Etsy. You'll find links to all of these in the show notes. I want to thank you all sincerely for listening. Now, back to the show. Leonardo was a bright painter too. Don't let the Mona Lisa fool you. That just has discolored garnish over it. But he used more natural gradients of color, as opposed to what is termed the cangiantismo of Michelangelo. That is using opposite colors to create effects of light and shadow, depth and volume. You see what I mean? It's creating a color gradient versus using contrast colors to make light and shadow. So, with these two dynamically opposed masters in the city, Soderini initiated what was consistently referred to as a contest, commissioning each of them, Michelangelo and Leonardo, to complete a painting in the enormous hall of the government palace, known now as the Sala del Cinquecento, the Room of the 500. Neither of these paintings were completed, but we do know what each looked like or would have looked like based on various drawings and copies. These are Leonardo's Battle of Anghiari and Michelangelo's Battle of Cascina, each of which show us exactly the major difference between the two masters in this moment. They would have started them, especially the Battle of Anghiari. All artists in the area would have looked at them, copied them. We know what they look like because we have copies, we have drawings, we have everything to know exactly what these paintings were meant to look like when completed. They were not completed. Michelangelo's, he created quite a particular scene, an ensemble of nude Florentines bathing in the Arno. This is supposed to be a battle scene, by the way. Nude Florentines bathing in the Arno, and it is the moment that they are notified of an upcoming attack. Okay, what is going to be the Battle of Cascina. But this painting reads more as a collection of nude bathers and men getting dressed than it does a battle scene. It has that linear sculptural quality to all of their nude bodies, a little bit of a sense of cluster and reaction, but it's really just a mass of twisting bodies, whereas Leonardo depicted the climax of the Battle of Anghiari with a clash of horses and armored men. He understood what he was being asked to do, perhaps a little bit more than Michelangelo. Now, Leonardo would try his oil-based fresco technique that tends to not properly adhere to walls. This is one of the things that messed up the Last Supper in Milan. And as such, his Battle of Anghiari had numerous technical setbacks that he would eventually abandon the work altogether. He just doesn't finish it, just like he doesn't finish anything else. And Michelangelo, upon the process of creating this painting, the Battle of Cascina, ends up getting called to Rome by the Pope, and he leaves Florence. So both are left incomplete. Of course, both masters had created other works in Florence during this period, many of which help us trace the development in Raphael's style based on his exposure to those works when he was there. Raphael is often cited and credited justifiably with the concept of a painterly union of styles. That is what we call unione. It's just Italian for union. This means he certainly came with that heavy influence of his master Perugino, but once exposed to the radical approaches of Michelangelo and Leonardo, he was able to harmonize their innovations with his experience from Perugino into what became his mature style. We might even be able to trace this to his personality, which, unlike the other two, he always seemed level, collected, professional, and above all, reliable because he usually finished his works. Happy patrons mean successful artists. In Florence, Raphael shared a patron with Michelangelo. That is the wealthy wool merchant Angelo Doni. In 1503, Michelangelo painted for the same patron, his famous Doni Tondo. That is a tondo, a painting that is round, tondo, and is named by the last name of the patron, Doni. So the Doni Tondo, which is the only completed panel painting by Michelangelo in the Uffizi Gallery. Well, it might be the only completed panel in the world that we can confidently attribute to Michelangelo. I think it is. From Raphael, Angelo Doni commissioned a pair of portraits in 1506, one of himself and one of his wife, Maddalena Strozzi Doni, from the Strozzi family. Maddalena Strozzi Doni, married to Angelo Doni. It is the Maddalena Strozzi portrait that I really want to focus on because from here we can surmise exactly what Raphael accepted and rejected from the Mona Lisa, which we must imagine that he saw in some capacity around this time. So do your best to have a look at the portrait of Maddalena Strozzi by Raphael. I'm pretty sure every one of us has the Mona Lisa burned into our memories. And I'm going to enlist the help of a prominent Renaissance art scholar named Luba Friedman, who summarizes the relationship between the Mona Lisa and the Maddalena Strozzi portrait in her article titled Raphael's Perception of the Mona Lisa. Friedman says that the Strozzi portrait, quote, suggests more sharply what Raphael rejected in the Mona Lisa. Again, his figure assumes the same pose as the Mona Lisa. Once more, she sits against a landscape background. Like the background with low hills and a lonely tree, her face is highly particularized, presenting all her minor natural deformities. In contrast to Leonardo's portrait, Raphael's is exactly what it intended to be. It is a portrait of a Florentine lady, Maddalena Doni. From this approach, its power as a portrait is derived, and from it also follows its weakness as a painting. Precisely because Raphael absorbed certain features of the Mona Lisa, he seated his figure in the Mona Lisa's posture, for instance, he indicates that what he left out, he rejected. That which makes a portrait cease to be a portrait in an ordinary sense. Raphael's painting becomes a pale imitation of the Mona Lisa. in its being a real portrait, in its rejection of all that makes the Mona Lisa an ideal, Raphael's Maddalena Doni, because of its down to earth perception of her personality, became a regular painting which portrays nothing but an individual figure. It is not an independent creation of the young Raphael, rather, it is just a pupil's imitation. End quote. Did we capture what that essence is? This amounts to Raphael is certainly learning from the composition of Leonardo's Mona Lisa. He even develops his own looser sfumato in order to render life and naturalism, but he does not raise his painting to the philosophical ideal threshold that Leonardo does with Mona Lisa. He is simply noticing the composition works and he is recreating it. No, Raphael, so different from Leonardo and Michelangelo, finishes his work, satisfies his patrons, completes them with elevation, but a harmony that does not disturb the comfortable balance of the artist patron relationship. I cannot conclude without a mention of the most significant compositional element that Raphael learned and adapted from his Florentine period, and that is the compositional pyramid, what we also call a Renaissance pyramid. It is an effect in painting that Michelangelo used in the Doni Tondo and Leonardo in his Virgin and Child with Saint Anne and his Mona Lisa, which expands the standard triangular composition from the Quattrocento into a pyramid, where groups of figures for a single sitter are built into a three-dimensional form. So Mona Lisa and Maddalena Doni, for example, their hands cross at the corner of two diagonals, which are their arms, which form the compositional pyramid base, and the heads of the sitters become the apex of the pyramid. In groups of figures, Raphael manifests this in his Madonna of the Goldfinch, directly quoting both Michelangelo and Leonardo, but with a harmonizing effect that blends the linear style of Michelangelo with Leonardo's sfumato. In Madonna of the Goldfinch, painted for the wedding of Lorenzo Nazi in 1506 in Florence, the pyramid is formed with the Christ child and St. John the Baptist in the foreground of the Virgin Mary, who herself fills the 3D plane and forms the apex of the pyramid, upon which Christ and St. John extend into the foreground rather than a triangle which puts them on the same plane. Renaissance people, this is such an enormously tender artwork, which is what I love so much about Raphael and what he develops after this time in Florence. He develops a sense of sweetness, but packed with meaning. Look at this painting, the Madonna of the Goldfinch. Tiny little St. John with his chubby little toddler body. He's cheesing as he holds up a goldfinch to the baby Christ. Christ pets the little bird in the cutest way with these little fingers, and gone are those dreadful George Costanza babies. This Christ, although certainly embodying his holy self, he is a baby, like an actual baby. He's chubby and he's fleshy and he's flushed with pink cheeks and fat little baby toes and fat little baby fingers. He's stepping on his mom's foot the way any 1 year old learning to walk might. But his pose is quite mature because it's derived from the kind of pose Michelangelo was developing from classical studies. And while we have all of this tenderness, this cuteness, a new sense of naturalism that relates the more human qualities of the divine to the viewer, we have to keep in mind that the goldfinch in which John the Baptist and Christ are interacting with is a highly religious symbol. Why is that? Because the goldfinch was known to have
eaten among the brambles, that is, the thorn bushes, and that it is a symbol of the crown of thorns in which Christ will be wearing when he is mocked in the moments before his crucifixion. So the tenderness does not subtract from the theological properties of the painting, but rather enhances them. Ultimately, the Madonna of the Goldfinch is a painting by Raphael, which is wholly indicative of his interaction with the arts of Florence before he transitions to Rome. Around this time, none other than Pope Julius II was commissioning artworks for the Vatican apartments. Raphael's recommendation to paint in Rome came from the architect Bramante, the architect from Urbino, who was working for the Pope on St. Peter's Basilica and no doubt wanted to promote another artist from Urbino and an artist who was indeed his distant relative. And so the newest major artistic innovator also left Florence for Rome. Michelangelo was already there working on the Sistine Chapel, and Leonardo was gone as well, leaving Florence without its masters and bringing the full force of the Renaissance to the Eternal City. Renaissance people, we are not going to jump directly into the High Renaissance in Rome quite yet. In the next episodes, we're going to explore the origins of the Renaissance in Rome that led to the major Vatican works, namely works like the School of Athens, the Disputa, and the Sistine Chapel ceiling, the Last Judgment, the Pietà, all of those things, but one step at a time. I know this was a lot to cover, David, Mona Lisa, Raphael, but I wanted to give you the essence of this extremely important moment in Renaissance history, the Soderini Republic, Florence from 1502 to 1512. Of course, Florence will elevate new masters once these three leave, but they tend to be overshadowed by what is going on in Rome, all in good time. Thank you all for listening, and until next time, arrivederci.